Thank you, Glenn, for the wonderful speech. We're going to open for the floor for the audience right now. So anyone who wants to make a question, please identify yourself and be brief if possible, please.
Peter Knight, renowned Ardeo Institute of World Economics. I was just wondering how you see the proposals of entrepreneurs like Andrew Yang, who's a presidential candidate, who wants for universal basic income fitting in with this scheme, and how you view, for example, the analysis that Robert Reich has in Saving the Capitalism for the Many, Not the Few, in terms of the rules that determine for free market.
Thank you. So on universal basic income, I have very mixed feelings. So as a matter of near-term practical politics, I have some sympathy for it. But as a matter of theory, I think it's fundamentally confused. The reason is that it's based on this notion that giving money to people is sort of like giving them directly resources and giving them then the freedom to determine it, what to do with it. But I think that totally misses the existence of market power and increasing returns and community and the importance of community. Because the truth is that no one eats money. So giving people money is not giving them directly resources. It's giving them very indirectly resources. And to get anything that they want with those resources, they need to buy it. From whom? From what monopolist who extracts what rents from them? And, you know, if you give money to a slave, what happens? The master takes the money. And you might say, well, we don't live in a society where the master takes the money. Well, if you look at the actual analysis that we have, the current tax extraction by market power in the economy, according to DeLocher and Ekut in their recent paper, is 70% in the United States. So you're taking 70% of that money and you're giving it to market power, rather than fostering the public goods that could replace that market power. So I don't think that the solution is top-down government public goods. I don't think those work very well. So I think there are reasons to move towards something that's more bottom-up. But I don't think that the universal basic income ultimately is the right solution for that reason. I don't know Robert Reich's book that much. I'm sympathetic to the idea of changing the rules, but I actually do think changing the rules requires based on capitalism, because I don't think it should be based on private property.
Mm-hmm. Another question?
They don't work anymore. So for instance, auctions. So it's a way to allocate goods in the economy. You use all the way. You talked about the spectrum auction, and you made a criticism about this. How do you think about this? Because we spend a lot of time thinking about these institutions, and you're proposing something else. This is something that's complementary to what you learn from this type of allocation system, or is completely different?
I'm going to give you a very, very nerdy answer.
Can I add one point to this? So can you connect this with general mechanisms in economics?
Yeah, absolutely. No. So thank you. What I wanted to say is that, and I'm going to give a very nerdy answer, so I'm sorry about that. But basically, all of these mechanisms are basically pretty direct applications of the Vickrey mechanism, which is the general optimal mechanism. The problem is that the literal Vickrey mechanism is too complicated and fragile. It's too over-optimized to a particular information environment and so forth. So instead, what these mechanisms are based on is a first-order approximation to the Vickrey mechanism, which achieves 99% of the benefits of the Vickrey mechanism, but it's way more robust in a whole bunch of different dimensions.
This is a theorem or it's an experimental thing?
Well, the question is what one means by a theorem, but you know, it's a theorem that they are first order approximations to the Vickrey mechanism or second. That's very easy to show. What makes them more robust? I don't think that robustness is something you can prove a theorem about, because I think that the term robustness, that as it's usually used in economics, is not the right way to think about robustness. The right way to think about robustness is in many, many different models and many ways of talking about something, does something not blow up? I have gone around the world talking about this, and I'm not saying there haven't been discussions or criticisms, but I don't think anyone has really been like, oh no, this is just completely ludicrous. There's no way it works. The Vickrey mechanism, the first time you present it in an econ seminar, someone will tell you that that's for sure the case, right? So like these mechanisms are almost all the way to the Vickrey mechanism, and yet they're things that you can with a straight face go and talk to politicians about. You can go and talk all around the world about them. So that's what I think we need more of, is things that come very close to the optimal, but are not just laughable in their fragility to the modeling assumptions.
Can I insist on that?
Yeah, please.
Because there's a lot on your theory based on how to implement it, and the quadratic voting is quite important on that. And, well, you mentioned the Vickrey mechanism, which is fragile for sure, but we all know the error impossibility theorem, so there's nothing in that field that we should expect not to be fragile, right? Including the quadratic voting.
Well, no, that's not true. So Arrow's theorem only applies to rank-ordered lists. It doesn't apply to quantitative mechanisms. So Arrow's theorem is not relevant here. The Gibbard-Satterthwaite theorem is relevant.
Well, it's
No, but wait. But the thing is that the Gibbard-Satterthwaite theorem only applies to literally strategy-proof mechanisms. And this one is approximately strategy-proof, and so it doesn't apply to that, actually. So it doesn't fall under these mechanisms.
Okay, so you're stating that the quadratic voting satisfies all the good properties of the arrow axioms.
When I told Ken Arrow about this, his reaction was, oh, that's the solution to the problem I was trying to get at in the 1950s.
And it is?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it depends on what you mean, because it doesn't literally satisfy his assumptions because his theorem is true, but it steps outside of the box and says, well, what if we add quantitative things to that, right? So, I mean, it satisfies the first and second fundamental welfare theorems, for example. So if you have a pure public goods economy, you can prove a first and second fundamental welfare theorem using quadratic voting as a constructive proof. So that's one way of thinking about it.
So is it robust to like buying votes for other people? Like
no, it's not, and neither is any voting system.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So that is a major concern. You need some way to deal with things like that, but it's far more robust than Vickrey is. So Vickrey in that setting, if you have Vickrey is so extreme on this dimension that it's actually an equilibrium to get any outcome in the Vickrey mechanism, because any two individuals can, at zero cost to themselves, achieve whatever outcome they want. So this one, there are some possibilities to buy votes, but it's not like instantaneously you go to whatever outcome you want. So.
And you are not afraid that if we rule a society based on this type of voting system, we might end up with much more lobby than we have today?
I mean, my guess, it's very complicated exactly what one means by lobbies.
Well, by like small group of people using resource to buy votes for not so interested people that
but I think that would happen a lot less, because you would have very few not so interested people, because the marginal value of your vote would be much greater in this world, because everyone would use votes on something they do care about rather than on things that they don't care about.
Okay, another question, please.
I would especially like to get questions from women if women are willing to ask questions.
Those who are not women, don't feel shy.
Yeah, please.
It's just
I think it's very important that people who aren't always invited to speak up by social dynamics get extra encouragement to do so, because often they have the best questions.
So I'm Vinicius from Peixe Urbano.
From what?
Peixe Urbano. It's similar to Groupon website here in Brazil.
Cool.
So historically, we've seen a lot of high-thinking societies getting totally dismantled by armies and all that. The historical, proposal of the state was to provide security.
Yeah.
Under this new system, wouldn't security be undervalued? I mean, is there a way to prevent it from any tyrants coming and taking care of the society and dismantling it?
Well, I think that security is a public good, and hopefully this would make good affordances for security. But ultimately, I think the greatest security comes in a widely shared set of principles. What is it that preserves international peace? It's not actually violence for the most part, because there's no international enforcer. What creates international peace is the expectation that other nations will take action if you do something against international law. And I think, eventually we'd like to get to a world with as few police people as possible and as much law enforcement, law obedience as possible. And I think that happens from having a large number of people who are actively engaged and who buy into the legitimacy of the principles, plus a lot of transparency about them. And that that's created by rules that are broadly accepted. So if you look at Norway, Norway has some of the highest obedience of laws and some of the fewest police, because there's so much community enforcement and because there's such a wide acceptance of the principles on which the society is governed. So I think coming up with better principles that are more widely viewed as legitimate will be very valuable to reducing the role that, quote, enforcement, unquote, has to play. But I also think there will be adequate provision for it in this sort of a world because public goods will emerge in a much more efficient way. Yes, wonderful.
Lucia,
Yeah.
Lucia Salgado from WERJ. Could you talk a little about your criticisms on the way that the U.S. antitrust authority are enforcing law comparing to Europe, for example?
Yeah. Well, I have lots of things to say about antitrust, but I'll give you a couple of examples. So I think pretty much antitrust has not been tried. What do I mean by that? I think most of the sources of market power in the modern world are completely ignored by current antitrust enforcement. Number one, there are a few institutional investors, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, Fidelity, that control most of the stocks of most of the US companies. And because they're diversified, they have no interest in seeing these companies compete with each other for consumers or for workers or in the political process. And antitrust could easily do things about this, and it's not enforced the law at all against any of these. So this is a huge problem. Second of all, and Europe has been more proactive on this, even though it's a smaller problem in Europe. Second of all, antitrust is completely focused on products sold to consumers, not on workers. But anyone who's ever worked a job knows that employers have much more power than people selling products to consumers do. And most antitrust laws are written to make that completely symmetric. So it's just a complete failure to enforce antitrust laws reasonably. And third, antitrust laws have not been enforced against tech companies buying up their rivals. when it's based on future competition rather than on current competition, even when very clearly the motive of the tech company is to squash future competition. So I think these are very basic things in antitrust, all much more important than what the antitrust authorities are actually focusing on, which need to be enforced and which would not require a fundamental change in any of the economics or the methods. It would just require actually applying the economics rather than being totally conservative and ignoring it when it affects the most powerful interests.
Another question?
Well, it's a little hard for me to get my mind around the quadratic voting. So let's take one of your examples of the Amazon River, for example. Okay, so we have it going through all these countries, and there are people in the populações ribeirinhas along the way, and then there are people who breathe oxygen around the world who have some interest in this as well, and there are farmers who want to cut down the trees and plant soybeans. So can you just give a little bit of an idea how your system would work for taking account of these diverse interests? I'd just like some example.
Well, I mean, at some level, what you'd sort of like to do is have some like state of the Amazon River, which is in charge of decisions about the Amazon and governs it, and that's democratic, but not in a simple sense. You'd like to give more representation to the people who are more affected, and you know, maybe you give 1/3 to the people who live there, 1/3 to the, you know, global climate body or whatever, and 1/3 to, you know, people who gain economic livelihood from it. I don't know, something like this, right? But the question is, why exactly 1/3, 1/3, 1/3? What should the shares be? Quadratic voting is a way of revealing that. That's the idea. Cecilia.
She was provoked.
So you mentioned towards the end of your talk that you got a lot of people reacting to your ideas and your book and implementing a couple of things that you mentioned. And thinking about moving forward, how do you see it going? So people implementing this, collecting data, getting evidence, and in what dimensions and what outcomes in what areas?
Yeah. Well, look, I think the movement is divided into 4 parts: ideas and research, activism and government, entrepreneurship and technology, and arts and communications. And I think all 4 of these are equally important. I think we need arts and communications to help people understand and communicate these ideas, to make them the basis of widely shared legitimacy so that it comes from the bottom up, not from the top down. I think we need entrepreneurship and technology to experiment with things, to make useful services, to fail and to succeed and to learn from each other, and to beat capitalism at its own game by eating it from the inside, by being more productive than capitalism and gradually gaining more resources. We need ideas and research to fix all the problems that I'm sure will be in the ideas, and to promote more ideas, and to learn from and to evaluate rigorously the experiments that are being done and learn what went wrong and what went right and to improve and all that sort of stuff. And we need activists to try to start building political coalitions to take the ideas that are more simple, like the antitrust ones, and near term, and build groupings around those, and to hold off the forces of populism that could make all this irrelevant by offering people hope. So I think all those things need to happen, and they need to happen in loose coalition with each other, because they each have to learn from each other and whatever. And that's why we created this foundation and this movement, because it provides that convening space for all those different groups working to communicate with each other and to learn from each other. I hope that answers the question.
Here, João Pedro of Economics in FGV. So can you detail more your idea of having clubs instead of states? Because I think it's very similar to capitalism ideas.
To what?
Having clubs instead of states.
And it's similar to what idea?
And capitalism ideas, I don't know.
Oh, anarchism?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, like somewhat.
Yeah.
But in the other
anarcho-syndicalism is what I think it's most similar to.
Let's say.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think these ideas are very spiritually close to anarcho-syndicalism in a lot of ways. But the problem is anarcho-syndicalism was never very clear about how it would actually work. And so it didn't really work. And I think this starts to give a technologically grounded formal structure to actually live out those ideas.
Okay.
Can I take this question? And
Yes.
so this is a pretty nice question you made, because it is something very deep and radical, as the book says, that you are proposing, and it's all based on a voting system. And there are two things that strikes me most. One of them is this. The other one I'll hold if you have time later, is about like taxing based on marginal utility instead of market price. But that we talk about that later. So the current system, the system we live, the political system, we elect politicians, they build a reputation, they vote, they have to think about things that are happening now, that will happen in the future, that will affect the next generations. And you are proposing to replace all that by voting system based on clubs that are self-formed. And I mean, is that what, I just want to like make sure that I understood what you're proposing.
I mean, exactly what fraction comes. Look, those politicians are themselves sort of like the leaders of the clubs, and they seek support. So there will be role for individual or small group initiative in making all of that happen. The voting rule plays a very important role in every layer of that process, but it doesn't need to all be direct democracy or anything like that. You know, you could use it within legislatures. In fact, one of the places it's being used right now is by the Democrats in the Colorado legislature to do their budgeting process. So it can be used by the politicians. It can be used to elect the politicians. It can be used flexibly. And exactly what combination is going to be most effectual is one of the many things that will emerge from doing all these experiments.
Another question?
I don't want to make this a debate, but this is pretty important, because we can. This could be seen as anarchist ideas, but depending on how hard you are on implementing a centralized voting system, could also be interpreted as like a very dictatorial proposal you're making, in the sense of like very centralized. But as far as I understood, you are not proposing to use voting system for everything, or replacing the current.
Well, I'm not saying that everything should be a referendum. I do think everything should be in some form democratically accountable. People sometimes ask me if I'm an anarchist. I usually say that I'm an agnarchist. I have sort of the same relationship to the state that an agnostic has to God. I'm not sure whether it really exists or not. And I think it's kind of a fantasy that we have in our imagination. Like, people tell me, like, oh, the state, it's the one that has the monopoly on this and that. And I say, oh, you mean Facebook? Do you mean Google? What exactly are you talking about, you know? The truth is that, like, we have this image of the state. But then you realize, oh, well, you know, this private corporation, is that the state? I mean, it's just not clear that that image that we have ever has existed or ever could exist. And it's, I think, the mismatch between our idealization of things and the way that they actually work on the ground that is the problem. And we need to have formalizations that actually take into account the realities that have to exist better.
Well, we have time for one or two questions, maybe.
I have one. Supposing we had implemented your model, where would your votes go to?
Well, you know, I live in a town called Hoboken, New Jersey, and I have no idea who's running for local office there or what the issues are locally. I'm the worst and most ignorant voter in that area on those local issues, and I really shouldn't have much say at all on those things. On the other hand, I think I know something about international politics quite well. And I'd like to have a say on some of these fundamental issues of institutional design. So, and that's where I choose to focus. And others will choose to focus on a more local level, and they should. And I think that this notion of people having the freedom to be free of politics, or rather, to choose which areas they care about politics in and which areas they don't. I think that's a fundamental aspect of freedom that's denied to us by the standard one person, one vote nation state system that would be allowed to us within this world.
Other question?
Hi, I'm Pedro from EPGE. And I don't know if I understood correctly the idea of quadratic voting. What I understood is that if I want something, I can give multiple votes to the same thing. But for that, I need an endowment of votes. And I could buy votes from other people, or...
No, you can't buy votes from other people. Everyone receives an equal endowment of voice credits.
Equal endowment. Okay, that's my question would be about the distribution of endowments. So, and I choose when I care about this thing, then I receive the same endowment of votes than everyone.
Yeah, but you might not use it in the same way as everybody else.
Okay.
Let me...
You're asking about the agenda. So you can actually do that in the same way that you do referenda, by having people tentatively commit some number of voice credits, and if it passes a threshold of total votes in favor, then it gets onto the agenda.
Let me try to make a point before you please go ahead.
Sorry, Tatiana. Sorry about my English, but I'm trying to make the question. So these systems of votes, you assume that everybody has education to vote correctly. How you plan to deal with locals that people don't have access to education? Here in Brazil, we have this a lot. So people from the river on Amazonia, they don't have education. So it's very common here, the corruption. So people buy the votes. So how these systems can work if people doesn't have an access to education to know how to vote?
So, I mean, offering people better access to education is obviously a very important thing. But I don't support literacy tests for voting in democracies, because I don't think that any central authority should be in charge of determining who has the competency to be involved in the democratic process. I think quadratic voting allows, to a large extent, that to emerge, because most people who are illiterate are incredibly knowledgeable about some local issues. And if you give them the opportunity to distribute their voice credits across the local things and the national things, I think most of them will choose to opt for more voice on the local things. And as they gain more education, they gain the perspective and interest to speak at a higher level of abstraction. So I think quadratic voting offers a way to do something like what a literacy test was meant to achieve, but in a way that allows still people to have equal voice by just choosing which issues they want to express themselves on.
If I may make a question.
Please.
There is a fact which is inherent to all democratic choices, all voting choices, which is the fact that those who are not yet born and those who do not have the age to vote are always underrepresented in any voting system. And you see the consequences of that mostly in pay-as-you-go system, in which sometimes one generation demands too much from the future generations, and it's funny that sometimes these future generations, which are the younger, they don't support ideas to correct this type of thing, mostly in social security. So that demands altruism and benevolence from one generation towards the younger ones. And this is the first question. And the second question is, I remember that Bertrand Russell, he wrote just after Bertrand Russell, just after the Second War was finished. He was not an admirer of the United States, but he wrote an essay defending the idea that the United States should be the monopolist of all weapons of mass destruction at that point in time, and that the United States should do that quickly, because otherwise other people would produce that, and there was only one point in time that could happen. Well, this guy was not any American found, so why did he say that? I think that he was somehow worried that the solution by the institution of communities or clubs who would try to enforce security at an international level would catch people in the middle of atomic attacks and so on, so that the externalities generated by this club could be worse than the monopoly, which was, of course, not something to be very clear about if that would be a good idea. Take the United States right now, that you may have an idea of that. And the same thing happens here in Rio de Janeiro when you see the militias, which is exactly the emergence of some groups which are not exactly coerced by ideas, but by the power of force, which by acquiring weapons and so on. And so this leads us to the idea that the endogenous generation of clubs in some areas, and I'm citing specifically public security, international or local, may be problematic. So how do you...
So these are both excellent questions. The first question, I would say, you're absolutely right. If you think about quadratic finance, it gives a lot more financing to things that benefit lots of people. But if some of those people are like just stuck in there as zeros simply because they can't express themselves now, that's a major problem. I don't know the exact right solution, but my intuition is that there's some sort of a mechanism that's kind of like saving, where if people contribute today to a mechanism, and then people later contribute, and that would have led to extra matching funds from before, you just give a ton of matching funds later. So when you contribute to something that has this sort of saved history, then you give more, and then people anticipating that are effectively going to, like, that'll give strength to the organization. It can kind of borrow against those future values. So I'm not sure about it, but I think that would be very interesting to try to figure out. The second idea, I think, fundamentally comes from the fact that existing group formation is subject to free rider problems, which leads to excess fragmentation and therefore potentially conflict in the way that you're describing. My hope is that this sort of group formation, because it gets beyond the private property idea, is not subject to that problem and therefore would lead to efficiently large organizations and therefore some sort of probably global authority on nuclear weapons. So I don't know, but that's the thought.
Any more urgent question? You? Just last question, please.
Hi, my name is João, and I kind didn't understand that much the idea of your voting system, but like you talk about it, the idea of majority against minority, and how that would apply to your voting system. Like, would something more voted than another group of interest have like more impact in the public politics or not?
Well, the idea is that if everyone has a fund of votes that they can apply to different issues, then the minorities can put more votes on it and therefore can potentially beat the majorities by having more votes rather than just more people voting.
Okay.
And so that would counter the problem of the tyranny of the majority.
Okay, but like poor people would have, the vote of poor people would have less impact than the vote of...
No, because everyone would have an equal number of votes, vote tokens.
Mm-hmm.
That's the idea.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm fine, whatever you want to do.
We have time for one more question. Meirelles. You want to talk about...
So my name is Daniel Duke. I work here at FGV. And so your voting system and your democratic system, it looks like it's based on mobilizing people, right? People should be mobilized into the main worries, right? Now in Brazil, we're facing a problem that is not that people are not mobilized, like extra mobilized about everything. And since Bolsonaro's election, now we have like weekly scandal on any topic, really any topic. So this week we're facing a Twitter debate on a cinema market here, cinema network here in Brazil that try to have expose a movie about dictatorship, and then they step back, and then now like there are these groups that extreme right groups and extreme left, or not even extreme left groups, that are debating on how we should deal with our dictatorship and historical, and well, how do we face, like, my point is, how do we face moral panics in society? How do we face people extremely mobilized about many issues that sometimes are not that important, not that is important. How can we face in this system this kind of issue?
Well, I think that this system has a lot of effective features for sort of combating extreme attitudes, because it becomes very effective to try to persuade your rivals to be a little bit less extreme. Because who's the person who can most cheaply give one more vote to you? It's the person who's most extreme against you and putting the most votes on the other side, because by just reducing by one their vote, they gain a huge amount of resources back, and they benefit you the same amount. So actually, I think people would focus most of their advertising on the most extreme people on the other side to try to convince them to just be a little bit more moderate. And as a result, we would have a lot more consensus in society, is my hope.
Last question, please.
Glen, let me ask you, how do you see the major challenges of capitalism in the United States facing now? What are the challenges? There are many many professors that are complaining about the way capitalism is developing in the United States. You take, for example, Luigi Zingali from the University of Chicago, Philip Kotler, John McKay. He's an entrepreneur, but he wrote with Harvey Cisadia. How do you see the critics, and how do you see the American people facing capitalism? And there are many people saying that there is a young generation in the United States that's going to go to the socialism type of economy. How do you see this for the future?
The thing I find across all political persuasions, with just talking to Uber drivers and so forth, is that people feel that communities are being disempowered and that power is fleeing away from things they can sort of understand towards forces that they feel are sort of oppressive and outside their control. I think everyone wants more agency back. I think everyone wants a more effective sense of control. People on the right call this decentralization. People on the left call this inequality, but I think it's the same complaint. And I think that there's a very powerful chance to address that using these types of ideas. And I think that a lot of young people are looking for something new. I don't think they necessarily want state socialism, especially with Donald Trump in charge of the state. So I think we have an opportunity to speak to them.
Okay. So let me start. Thank you all our students who have been here with us. Thank the professors, EPGE professors who are here, our guests, the amigos da EPGE, our EPGE friends, Fernando Travassos, Zé Meirelles, Tomás Tosta de Sá. Let me thank especially my wife, who is a very cold weather here and feeling cold, and Braido and Vagner, and of course our guest, Glen Weyl, who I know that it's 6 peace speeches in Brazil, right? That you're making.
No, it's 7.
7,
so.
yeah. It's in 2 or 3 days. Yeah. So we are very thankful not only for the insights that he has brought to us, but mostly for giving the example of somebody who takes an idea and takes that to the last consequence and tries to persuade people about what he thinks that is right. That's exactly what philosophers do and good economists pursue as well, which is defending your ideas as long as it's necessary to have people with a higher level of welfare, which is our ultimate aim. So thank you very much, and I hope we have you here another time.
Mm-hmm. My pleasure.
Thank you.